In this section, we're going to finally write the code out that's going to attempt to cache the list of blogs that are associated with a given user. So inside of my API/blogs route handler right here, we're going to first write out a little bit of code to create and initialize a new Redis client. We already wrote this code out inside of the node REPL a little bit ago, so it's going to look pretty familiar for the most part. Now, one other thing I want to mention right now is that for this first approach of caching these blogs, we're going to write all of the logic related to Redis and caching directly into this request handler. And we're doing that just so that we can easily clean up ourselves after we get some working implementation. So we are going to generalize all this caching logic very shortly, but first we're just going to test it out on this one handler. Okay, so that's why we're going to write all the code for this directly inside of here. So let's first get started by writing out some logic to require in the Redis library and then create a new Redis client out of it. So at the top of the request handler, I'm going to first require in Redis. I'll then define my Redis URL, which again is redis://127001 and port 6379 by default. We'll then create a new client that makes use of this Redis URL. So I'll say const client is redis.create client and pass in Redis URL. Okay, so as a reminder, let's walk over the logic that we really want to execute here. Okay, so let's find a slide back here. Where to go, where to go, where to go. This one's good. Okay, so remember, the entire idea here is that before we actually reach out to MongoDB, we want to first check to see if we have any cache data available for this particular query that we're trying to make on our cache server. If it does exist, we'll immediately respond to it and send that out to our React application. Other words, we want to reach out to MongoDB, issue the query, and then eventually send that back to Express and update our cache server with the result of the query as well. So that's the general idea here. Let's write out a couple of comments just to guide ourselves with this logic. So I first want to see, do we have any cached data in Redis related to this query? And we'll say, if yes, then respond to the request right away and return. So if we do have the result of this cache query available, we want to immediately send that back through the response and return from this handler. We don't want to do a darn thing else. Otherwise, if no, we need to respond to request and update our cache to store the data. Okay, so that's the general idea here. So let's now write in some code to satisfy these three comments. So at the very top, we're going to first check to see if we have any data already stored inside of Redis that matches this particular query we're trying to make. To do so, I'm going to write out const cached blogs equals client.get. And then remember, the thing that we're using as our key here is the user's ID. So every user has their own little pool of blog posts. So the ID alone serves as a unique and consistent key across requests to this handler. The user's ID is available on rec, remember that's a request, user.id. This is that user's ID right here. So I'm going to say client.get rec.user.id, like so. So that's step one. Now there's just one little issue here that we've already ran into without really realizing it. I took the result of client.get and tried to assign it to cached blogs. But as we saw just a moment ago in our terminal or in the REPL, whenever we call client.get right here, it does not instantly resolve with the result of the get operation. Instead, we have to make use of a callback function to get access to that thing. Now, I don't know about you, but there's no way that I want to try to write out all this complicated logic right here with the use of callbacks. Honestly, callbacks are kind of like a dying feature of Node, and we really try to avoid them as much as possible. Unfortunately, the Redis library that we're making use of here does not have native support for returning promises. But we can use a little bit of a trick. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little trick here to modify the way that this client.get function works to make it behave a little bit more like how we want it to work, which is to return a promise instead of using this callback. So I'm going to delete this callback right here. And then right after we make this client thing, I'm going to require in another module. So I'm going to say const util equals require util, like so. This is a standard library that is included in the Node runtime, and it has a bunch of, as you might guess, utility functions that we can use. One of the utility functions that is tied to this util module is a function called Promisify. Let me write that out because that's a tough word. Promisify. So this is a function. We can pass it another function like client.get, and it will return a new function that takes this thing's callback like nasty behavior and instead wraps it with some fancy logic that makes it instead return a promise, which is exactly what we want to do. So this Promisify thing right here takes any function whatsoever that accepts a callback as the last argument, like this one does, and it makes it instead return a promise. And that's the exact behavior we want. Okay, so let's write a little bit of code to promisify the client.get function right here. Okay, so we're going to write this out. It's going to look a little strange, but just bear with me. I'm going to say client.get equals util.promisify client.get. And notice how I'm not putting a set of parentheses after the .get right here. So we're passing a reference to the .get function to util.promisify. This takes that function, it wraps it all up with some fancy logic so that instead of making use of a callback, it instead returns a promise. So util.promisify right here, it returns a new function that has been promisified. So we take that new function and we overwrite the existing one on client.get right here. So that's the entire idea. Okay, so we're going to overwrite the existing function with this new fancy one that instead returns a promise. So now we do not have to use a callback here, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so now the very last thing, down here at client.get, so now instead of using a callback, because this thing returns a promise, we can now use the async await syntax with it, like so. So we put await, that will await for this promise right here to be resolved, and then whatever it resolves with will be assigned to cached blogs, which is hopefully our list of cached blogs. So that's pretty much it, at least for this part right here. Let's take a break right now because we did cover a lot in this section. We're going to come back in the next video and we're going to start to implement the rest of this request handler to handle caching inside of our app. So I'll see you in just a minute.